the Capitol in general. The Capitol, in which I have the privilege of working, is the third building to serve our state as the seat of state government. Michigan, of course, became a state in either 1835 or 1837, depending on your preferred version of history. And at the time, our Capitol building was in Detroit. Within about 10 years, though, we confused everyone by choosing to relocate to Lansing Township, which really didn't exist formally. There was a township on a map. There were 8 registered voters who lived there, which tells us there were probably about 8 white families in the area, because of course suffrage was limited to white males 21 and over at the time. But when we came, there was no Lansing proper. So we built a wooden Capitol building, which I will refer to today during my talk, which we used for temporary purposes. Well, temporary, translated into state government terms, meant we were there for 30 years before we were able to build something else. And it is our third building today that we will be really talking quite a bit about and using it as sort of a backdrop for our Capitol women, our Capitol ladies that are the subject of today's talk. This is an image of the building as it looked about 1879 when it first opened. It took us 6 years to construct. We broke ground in 1872. The building was designed by an architect named Elijah Myers, who would actually go on to be named America's greatest Capitol builder. He would design 5 capitols throughout his career, more than any other architect in American history. We finished it in the fall of 1878, and we started to move into the building. But in good fiscally conservative fashion, let's say, we decided to wait and celebrate its opening the same day we were going to inaugurate our governor, Charles Croswell. So we got 2 parties for the price of 1. And we officially opened and dedicated the building on January 1st of 1879. Now, as you look at this building in all of its late 19th century glory, and you picture it as it was in 1879, just take a moment. Think about that. Think about walking up that central sidewalk, going up the big stairs, because of course you could enter through that grand entrance in those days. You would have walked in through the doors. The state treasurer's office would be to your right. To your left was the auditor general. Keep going straight. You can stand in the rotunda and look up in the beautiful dome. And continue up the stairs to the legislative chambers on 2. Stop into the governor's office, perhaps, in the east wing. Then go up to the Supreme Court on the 3rd floor. My question for you is, how many women do you think were in the building at that time? 0. It's interesting that you say that. Now, we are saying this, of course, in the context of 1879. That's what I have asked you to imagine. But I would like you to fast forward over a century to when I started working in this building in 2005. Now, I am from a family that is from mid-Michigan. We've lived in mid-Michigan since just after the Civil War, when we came up from Ohio. And I am from a very average family. My father worked at a factory, my grandfather was a butcher. My mother taught Michigan history and government, which means I have been coming to this building for as long as I can remember. That being said, I grew up with a very politically aware mother. And while she never ran for public office, I always knew who was on the ballot. I remember helping her when she would volunteer on some political campaigns. I knew that my mother, as a woman, had political opinions and exercised her right to vote. And that seemed perfectly normal to me. Which explains, perhaps in part, why in 2005, when I started working in this building as a tour guide, I was flummoxed and, one might say, appalled when I had 9 and 10-year-old children raise their hands at some point in time on my tour every now and then and say, "Are there girls in state government?" Where this really hit home was the day that I was standing in the governor's formal office. So today the governor has 2 offices. The main office is across the street in the Bromley building, a 1920s hotel that's been converted into office space. And then the Capitol office is right up here on the 2nd floor in the east wing. To be perfectly honest, it's not too big. It's very lovely, but it's not set up to be a functional office for modern government. So today it's used for press conferences and bill signings, basically photo opportunities. And as I I'm standing in the doors of this office, which we can't bring people into because it's relatively small, but I have all these 10-year-olds staring at me. And I'm standing in this office, which at the time belongs to Governor Jennifer Granholm. I have a little girl raise her hand in the back, and she says, "Can a girl be governor?" And I thought, oh my God, this is 2005. This is not a child born in the 1950s, in the 1930s, in the 19th century. This is a kid who was born in the 90s. And she's asking me, well, we have a female governor, if a girl can be governor. And I thought, we really don't talk about women in government, do we? And over the last 13 years, this point has come home to me again and again. The truth is, in 1879, there were dozens of women who were working in this building. We'll talk about some rather interesting ones today. But most of us, even those of us who are historians, people who read, nerds, if I may call us such, don't necessarily realize that. It's not part of the image of state government that we have in our heads. So I would like to introduce you today to some of these women. We're going to talk about women who did all different sorts of jobs in the Capitol. And hopefully, by the time you leave, you will appreciate the fact that yes, there have always been women in the Capitol building. Our first woman we're going to talk about today is someone who has become a bit of a personal hero for me, as often happens. This is Harriet Augusta Edgerton Tenney. And Harriet, if there's any woman who understood her significance, it was her. In 1869, 10 years before our current building opened, 1869, Harriet was appointed the state librarian for Michigan. Now that was a really, really big deal. The state library at the time basically functioned as its own department in state government. The librarian was appointed directly by the governor and had to be confirmed by the Senate. And among her other duties was every 2 years, she would have to write a report on the state of the library. Sometimes these reports would include a list of items in the collection. They would talk about services she had provided, how the library had grown during the last 2 years, as well as her needs and her wants. So this is where she would often, sort of gently poke at the legislature and say, oh, by the way, I could do more if you would give me a little more funding for things. In her first report that she wrote and turned in 1871, she said this: by the advice of the chief executive of the state, and with the unanimous was italicized in this writing, with the unanimous consent and approbation of the Senate, on the 31st day of March, 1869, this library was placed in the charge of a woman. And she spelled woman, capital W, capital O, capital M, capital A, capital N. There is a woman who understood her significance. Now, who was she? How did she get there? Well, like so many early Michiganders or Michiganians, take your pick, she was originally from the East, from New England. She was born in Vermont in 1834 to a teacher and a pastor and his wife. And she came to Michigan with her family as a young woman. Now, when she was a youth, her family actually moved back to Vermont. And hopefully someday I will figure out what inspired these moves. But we know that she had an academy education while in Vermont, which was about as good as an American girl in a small town could expect at the time. There were no real high schools of the sort yet in this country. An academy education was a private school education, and of course the quality could vary based on the quality of the teaching staff. But this was a good education for a woman of her era. When she finishes and graduates, she becomes a teacher. This is something you will hear me say 15 times today, at least. Women were entering the teaching profession in increasing numbers in the early to mid-19th century. And part of it stems from this idea that was being discussed more and more so, that women made good teachers. Now today, we think of women as teachers. It's become part of our cultural understanding, if you will. In fact, some people, my mother, who graduated from school in 1969, says, well, you know, basically at the time, if you wanted to have a career, you became a teacher, you became a nurse, you became a secretary. These were sort of the standard options for women. That wasn't so in the 19th century. But there was a group of very smart women who wanted an education, who started to argue that women, as natural mothers, so the thinking went, would be inherently good school teachers because they were already attuned by nature to be sympathetic to children. Now, how much of this they believed and how much of it was simply a good excuse for getting more education, we can argue over that. But the truth is, throughout the 19th century, it suddenly became not only acceptable, but desirable to have women entering the teaching profession. And this was a gateway for a number of the women that we will talk about today, who would go on and eventually do other things. Harriet taught for a few years. She married a gentleman who was a very accomplished lawyer, and she ultimately came back to Michigan in the 1850s, where she and her husband started a school. In 1859, then, her husband, Jesse, was appointed the state librarian. Now, the library was, at this time, in this wooden Capitol building that you'll see down here in the corner. It was a mess. The Tennies hated it. This was a small wooden building, 2 stories tall, again, built to be temporary. This was where we housed state documents. This is where we housed our collection of books, and it was wooden. This is the 19th century. You are heating and lighting this building using fire. They were all too aware of how vulnerable that collection was. And even though it was Jesse who was technically state librarian, we believe Harriet was there pretty much from day one. They seem to have always worked as a pair. And Jesse, to be honest, had other fish to fry. He was more interested ultimately in a legal career. And so slowly but surely, Harriet is going to the library every day in some instances. She is taking over officially while her husband is out of state on a book buying trip, or is handling legal matters somewhere else. She becomes so much a part of state government that in 1869, when her husband is having some health issues and decides that he is not going to ask to be reappointed, because again, you're appointed every 2 years by whoever happens to serve as governor at the time. Harriet writes a letter to the governor. This letter is a dance, if it is anything, because she is walking a very fine line here. On one hand, she cannot be seen to be overstepping. Part of being an acceptable woman in 19th century culture meant that she had to defer to the men around her to some extent, and she also had to not appear to lose her femininity. On the other hand, she was asking the governor to make her the first official female head of a department in Michigan. She was asking for something that had never happened before in the state. So she starts off her letter asking the governor if she should apply for this position. And then she spends the rest of the letter promptly applying for the position and giving him a long list of reasons that he should appoint her. And she is very careful to note things, such as the fact that she is physically capable of picking up the books and carrying them and doing the physical work demanded of a librarian. Because, of course, this is exactly the sort of argument that someone would make. Well, you're a woman. You have a weak constitution. You are not able to do the labor. And she says, don't tell me I can't do this. I have been doing this. I know what the job requires. She then, in the second page of her letter, starts listing prominent lawyers and other figures in state government who support her appointment. This woman has done her homework. She is not going to give the governor an easy out. So 10 days later, he appoints her, and the Senate confirms her appointment. Harriet would ultimately go on to serve 22 years as state librarian. During this time, she grew a collection that was a few thousand volumes into a collection that was over 50,000 volumes. I think one of the happiest days of her life was probably the day she got to move into this. This was the new state library in the new state capitol building, which was not a room piled floor to ceiling with books in a wooden building. It was a 3-story space located in the west wing of the building. Now I will tell you, in the Capitol, everything is political. Everything. Including space. And you can tell who has how much power based on who occupies which space. Originally, when the building opened, of course, it housed all of state government. So the departments had the first floor. The legislature had the wings on 2 and 3. Their rooms are actually 2 stories tall, so you have not only the floor level, but public galleries. The governor had a very nice suite. The Supreme Court had a very nice suite. But do you know who had almost an entire wing of the building under her control? Harriet Tenney. That's incredible. Now, as state librarian, she also had a very, very public role, not only in Lansing, but in the state in general. And it is interesting to read the newspapers throughout her tenure, and you come to see that her name equals the state library. Or when you say state library to someone, it equals Harriet Tenney in their minds. In fact, she has a bit of a hiccup in her tenure in the 1880s when a Democratic fusionist is elected governor. Now again, everything is political, and everything always has been political. Harriet was an appointee. Her husband was a party man. Now, of course, the biggest, strongest party by far in this era of Michigan politics is the Republican Party, founded out of the belief that slavery must be abolished. Now, Harriet, of course, as a woman, cannot vote, and she does not, that we have found, voice political opinions herself too loudly. But she is inherently tied to the party because of Jesse. So I find it remarkable that a woman who is ostensibly a Republican is being discussed in Democratic newspapers when a Democratic fusionist has come into the governor's office. And you know what that newspaper says? This newspaper I'm referring to is the Detroit Free Press, which was very much the organ of the Democratic press in the state. The Detroit Free Press tells the governor in black ink, do not get rid of this woman. There are 2 people in state government that they consider to be above party, that they consider to be untouchable. One was John Robertson, who had been the Adjutant General of the state since the Civil War, a highly respected figure in Michigan's military history. He wrote Michigan in the War, by the way, if you have a copy of that sitting on your shelf at home. He was also responsible for compiling the Brown books. The other person was Harriet Tenney. And you know what? She survived. Unfortunately, she didn't survive the next change in party. And in 1891, when a new governor was elected, he decided to clean house. And that included retiring Harriet, if you will. And I think that must have been an extraordinarily difficult period for her, because she had been working in the library for 32 years by this point, and she had come to feel that in some ways it was hers. In fact, her protege, Mary Spencer, when she eulogized Harriet after she died in 1899, she said the books were like her children. The library was her love. And she had had the privilege and the honor of being its face. She had also had the very awesome responsibility of being the very first power-wielding woman in Michigan's state government. Now, she is remembered outside of the Capitol today. She is much beloved by an organization represented by this symbol right here, the Lansing Women's Club. Harriet actually founded the Lansing Women's Club in 1874. And if you know anything about the history of the Women's Club movement in this country, it was a movement to help women continue to educate themselves throughout their lifetimes. That was something that Harriet believed in very, very firmly, and that she would support throughout her days. To say, though, that every woman who worked in the Capitol was a Harriet is to ignore the historical record, because there were plenty of women working at all different levels of government. And on perhaps the other end of the spectrum, we have Mary and Catherine Coos, who worked in the building as laborers and janitresses. to use a good 19th century term. Now, Mary was the mother, Katie was the daughter. Katie was actually born in England to Mary and George Coops, and she immigrated here with her family as a child. The family settled in Lansing and very quickly started to seek out government jobs. Now, Lansing today we think of as the capital city. Many people tie it instinctively to Michigan State. But the truth is, Lansing had even more state institutions at the time. This was really the backbone of Lansing for many years until the auto industry got up and going. If you look at how government changed Lansing, of course you have to start with the move of the capital. But once Lansing became the capital, it automatically became a very tempting place to put other government entities that the legislature wanted to keep an eye on. So when they established the Agricultural College, they put it just a few miles down the road. When they established the Boys Reform School, they did the same thing. When they separated the School of the Blind from the School for the Deaf, they put the School for the Blind in Lansing. So by 1879, you have 4 major government-connected institutions, all within 4 miles of the Capitol building. And as this is the age of patronage, that means that there are lots of good patronage jobs to go around. And that includes people who are working as laborers, as janitresses. Now, the Coops family were not salaried employees in the way that Harriet was. They basically did piecework of a sort. They would come in and they would be hired on for specific jobs for a specific period of time. You can see here in the census, George has listed himself as a janitor in the Capitol, as has Mary. If you look down here, these are excerpts from the Auditor General's reports. Here you can see George and Mary were paid for 3.5 days' work cleaning windows, $10.50. Katie, their daughter, was paid $2.25 for washing 45 pieces. That means she washed 45 linens, because this is a building, of course, with many restrooms in it. And in those restrooms, you will find actual hand towels, not of the paper sort, in the 19th century. And of course, someone had to launder these linens. And so this was what Katie did. And truth be told, there was plenty of work to be done in this building and caring for it. Over the years, the Coops family washed windows, they cleaned furniture, there was lots of walnut furniture to dust. As janitresses, they also probably helped out with emptying these. I'm pointing to what the Victorians called the door, otherwise known as spittoons. Now, this, of course, had to rank pretty high on the more unpleasant jobs in the building, and also probably pretty high on the more dangerous jobs, because, of course, we did not yet have a good understanding of germs. When you are dealing with over 300 spittoons that need to be emptied, you can only imagine the sorts of things that you are being exposed to. Now, somewhere in the pecking order, between Harriet and Katie, there were clerks. There were clerks in abundance. This is one of my favorites. Her name was Belle Maniatis. She was the daughter of a Greek naval officer who was a bit of a hero in his home country, immigrated to the U.S. and settled in Michigan. She was born in 1863 in Marshall, and ultimately would be orphaned in the sense that her father passed away, and her mother struggled to support her family. So her aunt and uncle stepped in, and her uncle had connections in Lansing. By this point in time, the family was living in Jackson, and we know that by the 1870s, her brother actually was serving as a page in the legislature. This was a job for young boys at the time who were 13, 14 years old. Belle manages to stay in school. She graduates from high school in Jackson, and then she gets a job in a pension office down in Detroit. She is working, of course, in a government office dealing in Civil War pensions. This was a major piece of government in the late 19th century. In Michigan alone, a quarter of our male population fought in the Civil War, which meant there were 90,000 veterans in the state and veterans' families that would need services for the decades to come. Belle would work in Detroit for several years, But in the 1890s, she got a better job in Lansing. So she picked up, moved to the capital city, and here she would stay for the rest of her life. Belle would ultimately work in 2 offices in the capital. She started off working for the Auditor General, who of course was dealing with financial matters. Then she moved across the hall into the office of the Adjutant General, which would have been a very nice fit for her, given her history working already with military pensions. Now, there were a lot of clerks, a lot of female clerks working with Belle and Sarah. In fact, I went back through the Auditor General's reports, and the year the building opened, 1879, throughout that year, there were 68 clerks who came in and out of the Auditor General's office. Now, not all of them were there all year. Some would simply come in and work for a couple months when it was the busy time and they were trying to get everything closed out. But of those 68 clerks, 31 of them were women. We can even dive a little further and determine that of those women, 20 of them were Miss, 11 of them were Mrs. Now, of course, Mrs. can mean either married or widowed, and it is difficult to know. Chances are many of those Mrs. that you see listed were actually widowed women who were working to support themselves. But being a career woman meant that you had certain advantages that your sisters, who were wise and family women, did not. For example, most women who worked in the capital who were single lived in boarding houses. In fact, Harriet and Jessie lived in a boarding house, I believe, so she could pursue her career. She didn't have to keep a house. She didn't have to entertain and do all of the things that went with that in Victorian culture. For Belle, being able to go home at night and have the toilet already scrubbed and dinner already on the table meant that she could have a hobby. Belle not only labored in an office, probably quite similar to this in the Capitol. This is a turn-of-the-century image of some of the Auditor General's space. Belle wrote. She wrote short stories that started to be picked up by newspapers across the country. If you subscribe to the right newspaper database, you will find hundreds of these. Now, they start off simply as short little moralistic tales. You know, they're a couple columns long in the newspaper on page 4 or 5. They almost all have happy endings. You know, the orphan is adopted by a nice family, the sweet girl marries the boy next door, the widow woman founds the treasure that her husband left for her after a bit of a hunt. These are feel-good stories. And she was actually eventually picked up as an author for a newspaper syndicate, so these were being published all across the country. She is able, though, to actually take it up the next level, and she starts to have novels published. She wrote either 7 or 8 novels in the early 20th century, and I had a chance a few years ago to meet a woman who is actually studying Belle and hoping to write a biography of her. And she wanted to come to the Capitol to see where Belle would have worked and get a feel for what the culture of the place would have been at the time. And as we're wandering through the building and I'm talking to her, I said, so, you know, do you see state government in any of her novels? Because I'd never heard of her before and I hadn't read any of her books. And she looked at me and kind of smiled and she said, well, her first novel was about a little boy who grows up to be governor. I said, well, that answers that question, which means I probably bought a copy, read it the next weekend, and I have no doubt that I probably thoroughly annoyed my husband by squeaking or chirping about 18 times, because as I was going through this novel, there are actually significant portions of it that are set in the Capitol building. Because before he becomes governor, this boy serves in the legislature, so there are scenes in the legislative chambers. There are scenes in the rotunda where he's talking about his little war battle flags. There's a very important scene towards the end of the book in the governor's office. And I know exactly what she is talking about. You know, there is a scene where while he is in the governor's office, he goes over to the sideboard and opens it up and pulls out a pitcher and offers his guest some water. I know which sideboard that is. That's pretty cool. Ultimately, though, it was not David Dunn that would win her greatest acclaim. It was Emma Riley of Close on Alley, which in the teens was made into a silent film starring Mary Pickford. That was about as high as you could go in American pop culture at the time. And this was the product of a pen of a female clerk working in the Michigan State Capitol building. Now, one of Belle's contemporaries was Marie Brown Ferry. Marie was a widow. There are, of course, certain types that you see over and over again in these women who are working in government, and widows certainly made up a large percentage of that population. Marie was originally from New York. She moved to Michigan in the late 19th century, so this is long after the Civil War, with her husband, and they own a furniture store in Lansing. They co-own it with another family. When her husband dies, though, he basically leaves her his share in furniture business and not much else. So as a former teacher, she has enough of an education to be able to go get a job as a clerk in state government. And within a few years, she actually spins us into a position with the Michigan Pioneer Society. Out of curiosity, are you familiar with the Pioneer Society? Some of you may have heard of it. The Pioneer Society was formed in 1874 to record the stories, they didn't call them oral histories at the time, but close, to record the stories and collect objects from Michigan's pioneer generation. There was a sense that these people were starting to pass away, and we needed to learn their histories before it was gone. It also, of course, is only 2 years before the centennial. So this is at a time when we're getting very excited about American history and starting to really see value in the stories of our own countrymen and women. Now, one of the founders of the Pioneer Society is Harriet Tenney. She was their first recording secretary, actually, and will serve on its board until 1891, when she leaves her position in the Capitol building. But there are many other women who got involved over the years. In fact, Marie is hired by the Pioneer Society in the 1890s to do indices for the Pioneer collection, which was a nice thick volume collection of volumes that were published in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. And she also takes care of some of their correspondence. Marie ultimately, though, makes the job much more. She starts putting together exhibits in the 4th floor museum in the Capitol, which you can actually see an image of here. This is a rostrum from the first state capitol in Detroit that was collected and preserved. She also, as a former teacher, is really interested in promoting history education. So she teams up with the state superintendent, with some significant Michigan historians and collectors, and she basically goes on the road and gave talks all over Michigan on various aspects of state history. She also was sort of the unofficial tour guide, if you will, for the Capitol building and for the Historical Museum. She would put thousands of visitors through that collection every year. Finally, by the time the Pioneer Society was able to get to a point where they could found officially the Michigan Historical Museum, at the age of 69 years old, she was named their very first official curator. And she worked for them up into the last years of her life. You can see an image of her here. In fact, she lived long enough that in 1922, when the Lewis Cass building opened, which is what this museum would be moved into, she actually oversaw that move herself. For me, though, I will always love Marie because she saved this. So this image over here on the right is an image of the governor's parlor as it looked about the time the building opened. Incidentally, this little sliver over here, that's the sideboard that's in Mel's book. The parlor suite that you see here was designed and manufactured by the Fiji Company of Saginaw, Michigan. It is a very rare example of Michigan-made furniture in our capital. We don't have as much of it as you would expect. And when it was installed, of course, in the parlor in 1879, it was the latest and greatest thing. But time marches on. Things fall out of fashion. And by the early 20th century, the governors weren't so excited about this Victorian stuff anymore. So about the time of World War I, Marie actually manages to broker a deal with the governor. He wants to get rid of this. And she says, don't throw it in the trash, don't put it out as salvage, give it to me. So she takes it into the collection of the Michigan Pioneer Society, about to become the Michigan Historical Museum. The museum takes care of it for the next 80 years. And suddenly, in 1990, as we're restoring the Capitol building, trying to take this office back to its original appearance, we are able to reacquire, working with the museum, that original parlor suite and bring it back to the building where it is today, thanks to Marie's foresight. It is incredible to think that it took 80 years for us to come around on this issue. But because of her efforts to preserve those treasures in the early 20th century when no one else wanted them, today we have a properly furnished parlor. Another significant group of women that you see working in the Capitol are the young unmarried women who would come in normally after finishing high school. This is the early 20th century when the Mccabe sisters come to us. So now we do have a proper set of high schools in the state. And by the way, in many cases, there were more women attending those high schools than men, partly because men were generally expected to leave school and start earning a wage earlier than women were. Now, these women in high schools are often studying things like penmanship, stenography. You can take typing classes. In fact, by this point in time, the word typewriter does not mean the machine as much as it means the person operating it. So a typewriter was a woman who, by the way, has nice, thin, agile fingers and has often been taught to play the piano since she was about 5 years old. That typewriter is a woman. And there were dozens and dozens of them in the Capitol building. Now, the Mccabe sisters came from Paw Paw initially. They had, again, good family connections. The husband of their older sister was friends with a new senator who was elected in 1912. And so as a favor for helping him get elected, the family decides that they are going to send Anoline to work in the Capitol. Anoline is initially given a job as a clerk for the Senate. Now the difference is, our legislature at that time is only in part-time. So the legislature is generally meeting every other year, and they meet for 4, 5, 6 months maybe. So working for the legislature is not a full-time job in the way it is today. Anoline clerks throughout that session, and then she will take a position for the Secretary of State. She doesn't stay too long, though, because while she was clerking in the Senate, she did what no respectable, good young woman was supposed to do. She caught the eye of a legislator. Now, happily for her, this legislator was a young unmarried man from Detroit. His name was James Lee. He was the boy orator of the Senate. And he took one look at this pretty young feminine clerk from Paw Paw and decided that there were many advantages to serving in state government. Now, their romance became not only the talk of Lansing, it actually made society columns across the state. And according to her younger sister, Vivienne, who my predecessor interviewed when she was 99 years old, the family was totally embarrassed when it was announced that their daughter had not only caught the eye of, but was going to marry the boy senator from Detroit. Now, it did not appall the family enough, though, that they didn't send another daughter. As soon as Anoline gets married and heads home, it's Vivienne's job to come to Lansing. And one reason these sisters are able to make this move so quickly is because they also had a family member working in government. Their uncle worked for what was then the Bureau of Insurance, sort of a department on its own. Their aunt and uncle lived just a few blocks behind the Capitol, and needless to say, they learned their lessons from the experience with Anoline, because Vivienne talked about how she was expected to walk to the Capitol every morning with her uncle, and her uncle was expected to walk home with her each evening. So she was being very carefully chaperoned. And this actually worked out to her advantage in that one night she was sent to take some ledgers up into the dome, which is where they were storing extra things at the time, and she actually got trapped up there. And luckily for her, her uncle noted her absence, realized what had happened, and was able to get someone to open up the entrance to the dome. I will tell you, I've been up there. No one in their right mind would want to spend the night up there in that space. And Vivienne also made the newspaper, although we don't know if she ever told her parents this. 2 years after her sister was discussed in newspapers